The grand ballroom of the Langham Hotel shimmered under the light of 1,000 crystals. It was a scene from a postcard, a world of polished silver, delicate china, and the low, expensive hum of well-bred conversation. The air smelled of perfume, old money, and the faint, sweet aroma of champagne. This was the exclusive gala following the celebrated autumn recital of Victor Kane, and everyone who was anyone in London's musical and social circles had secured an invitation. Victor Kane stood by the fireplace, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, holding court. He was a man carved for such a setting tall, with a head of distinguished silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. His smile was a practiced tool, deployed to charm donors and disarm critics. Tonight he was basking. His performance of Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata had been, by all accounts, a triumph. The reviews tomorrow would sing his praises, and the crowd here tonight was his chorus. He moved through the room like a sleek ship through calm water. A nod to the critic from the Times, a warm handshake with a duchess known for her patronage, a witty remark to a wealthy industrialist. Each interaction was a small performance, reinforcing his place at the very center of this glittering universe. He loved the rustle of silk, the glint of jewelry, the way people leaned in slightly when he spoke. This was the reward, he felt, for a lifetime of dedication to his art. In a quiet corner, partly shielded by a large potted fern, sat Martha. She looked, to the glancing eye, entirely out of place. Her dress was a simple navy blue, a clean, classic cut, but it was clearly not new. It was the kind of dress worn to important, but not fashionable, occasions: a funeral, a niece's wedding, a retirement dinner. She held a small clutch bag on her lap, her hands, which were marked with the gentle wrinkles of age, folded over it neatly. She had saved for 18 months for this. The ticket to the recital had taken a large chunk of her pension, and the gala invitation had cost what she usually budgeted for 3 months of groceries. But she hadn't hesitated. To hear Victor Kane play Beethoven in that hall was a dream she'd held since she was a girl, listening to crackling recordings on a gramophone. The music tonight had moved her to silent tears. It wasn't perfect. She had noticed a rushed passage in the second movement, a moment where feeling triumphed over absolute precision. But it was alive, powerful. It spoke to her in a language she had spent her own life trying to understand. Her companion, a kindly former colleague from the primary school where she'd taught music for 40 years, patted her arm. "Wasn't it just magnificent, Martha?" she whispered. Martha's eyes, a soft gray blue, were still wide with the echo of the music. "It was more than that," she replied, her voice a low, earnest murmur. "Did you hear the way he shaped the adagio? Not as a sad thing, but as a deep remembering. He wasn't just playing the notes. He was remembering the feeling behind every single one." Her words were not the technical jargon of a critic, but the plain, heartfelt observation of someone who listened with her whole self. They were overheard. A young socialite, draped in emerald green silk, smirked to her companion. "How quaint," she breathed, not quietly enough that Victor Kane, circulating nearby, heard the snippet of conversation. His attention was caught not by the insight, but by the source. His eyes swept over Martha, the dated dress, the unstyled white hair, the humble posture. An idea, cruel and clever, began to form in his mind. The evening, while a success, felt predictable. It needed a spark, a moment of levity. Here was the perfect opportunity. He finished his conversation with a prominent conductor and, with a glass of champagne in hand, made his way deliberately towards the corner. A small, curious cluster of people instinctively drifted in his wake. Sensing a shift in the room's energy, he stopped before Martha's small table. The hum of conversation around them dipped noticeably. All eyes turned to them. "Good evening," Victor said, his rich, theatrical voice making the simple greeting sound like a proclamation. He offered her the brilliant, stage-perfected smile. I couldn't help but overhear passionate appreciation of the adagio. Martha looked up, startled. A faint pink flush touched her cheeks. She was not used to being the focus of attention, especially from a man like this, who seemed to take up all the air in the room. "Oh," she said softly. "It was very beautiful, Mr. Kane." "I'm so glad you think so," he said, his tone dripping with a patronizing warmth. He turned slightly, ensuring his voice carried to the growing audience. One can always tell a true enthusiast, someone who feels the music in their very bones. Unburdened by all the dusty old theory. He gave a little chuckle, and a few people in the crowd echoed it politely. Unsure where this was going, but trusting the maestro's showmanship, Martha simply nodded, her hands tightening on her bag. She felt a prickling on the back of her neck. Victor gestured grandly towards the gleaming Steinway grand piano at the head of the room, which had been the evening's silent, majestic centerpiece. "In fact," he continued, his voice rising to a pitch that captured the entire ballroom, a profound silence fell. Even the waiters paused. "We should celebrate such genuine, unadorned love for the art. It's the heart of what we do, isn't it?" He looked down at Martha, his smile widening. "Perhaps you would do us the honor? The piano is right there. Favor us with a simple tune. A folk song from your youth, perhaps? A little something to remind us all of music's humble beginnings." The request hung in the air, a glittering trap. It was not a genuine invitation. It was a performance in itself, a piece of theater. He was the magnanimous king, offering the peasant a moment at the throne. The expectation was a flustered refusal, a bit of charming, humble comedy to break the formal ice. The crowd watched, a mix of anticipation and mild embarrassment on their faces. Some felt sorry for the old woman. Others were merely curious to see how the great Victor Kane would handle the situation. Martha's companion shot Victor a look of pure fury, but was too stunned to speak. Martha herself seemed to shrink for a second into her chair. She looked from Victor's expectant, amused face to the sea of staring eyes, then to the distant, imposing black bulk of the piano. The room waited. You could hear the faint clink of a glass from the kitchen. Then something shifted in Martha's face. The initial shock and embarrassment seemed to melt away, replaced by a calm, almost detached resolve. The flush faded from her cheeks. She looked directly at Victor, and for a fleeting second he saw not a flustered old woman, but a quiet, unnerving steadiness in her gaze. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her clutch bag on the table. She gave her friend's hand a small, reassuring squeeze. Without a word, she pushed back her chair and stood up. The simple movement sent a ripple through the crowd. This was not going according to script. She wasn't protesting or running away. She was accepting. A deeper, more intrigued silence settled over the room as she began the long walk across the polished floor towards the piano. Her sensible, low-heeled shoes made soft, steady taps that echoed in the hush. Every step took her further from the safety of her corner, deeper into the blinding spotlight of the room's full attention. Victor, his champagne glass paused halfway to his lips, watched her go. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, quickly smoothed over. He hadn't expected this, but he adapted, turning to the audience with a gracious, if slightly forced, smile, as if to say, "Look at the brave sport she is." He then followed her at a leisurely pace, coming to lean against the side of the piano, crossing his arms. The stage, he felt, was still his. He was now the benevolent host of an amusing impromptu interlude. Martha reached the piano. She stood before the bench for a moment, looking not at the crowd, not at Victor, but at the instrument itself. Her expression was one of deep, private recognition, like someone greeting an old friend they hadn't seen in many, many years. She reached out a hand and gently, almost reverently, ran her fingertips along the edge of the closed fallboard. Then she sat down. She took a moment to adjust the bench, sliding it a fraction of an inch. She opened the keyboard, the lid already raised like a great black wing. The ivory keys seemed to glow under the lights. She placed her hands in her lap for a second, her eyes closed. She took a slow, deep breath, shutting out the rustling crowd, the expectant stares, the smug presence of the famous man leaning just a few feet away. The audience held its breath. They expected perhaps a halting scale, the opening notes of Fur Elise, or, as Victor had suggested, a wobbly folk melody. They were ready to applaud kindly, to reward the effort, and then move on with their evening. Having enjoyed a quaint little moment, Martha opened her eyes. Her posture, which had been slightly stooped, straightened. Her shoulders went back. She raised her hands, and in that simple motion, the last trace of the timid woman vanished. Her fingers, those wrinkled, age-spotted hands, hovered over the keys with a sudden, poised authority that was impossible to fake. Then she began. The silence in the ballroom was complete. It was a heavy, waiting kind of silence, thick with curiosity and a touch of pity. All eyes were fixed on the simple figure on the piano bench. The only movement was the gentle swirl of champagne in a few forgotten glasses. Martha's hands, which had hovered for that eternal second, descended to the keyboard, but they did not land with a gentle, searching touch. They did not fumble for a simple melody. Instead, her right hand came down in a powerful, clean arc, striking a low, resonant bass note with the flat of her fingers. It was not a note you played daintily. It was a declaration, a deep, tolling bell that vibrated through the floor and up the spines of everyone present. Before its sound could fade, her left hand answered, a complex, rolling chord that was both dark and sweet. Spreading like ink and water. It was not chopsticks. It was not Fur Elise. It was not a folk tune. The two opening chords hung in the air, rich and impossible. A man near the back, a financier who knew nothing of music, but knew the sound of authority when he heard it, choked on his canape. The socialite in the emerald dress stopped smirking, her smile freezing into a confused line. Victor Kane, leaning against the piano, felt the first cold trickle of surprise. His professional ear recognized the harmonic language instantly. It was Russian. It was romantic. It was serious. The posture of her hands, the shape they made over the keys, this was not the posture of an amateur. The casual, cross-armed stance he had adopted felt suddenly foolish. He uncrossed his arms, standing up straighter. Martha did not give them time to think. Her head was bowed, her gaze locked on her own hands, seeing a world that was no longer the glittering ballroom. She was somewhere else entirely. The initial chords melted into a flowing, sorrowful melody in the right hand. Supported by a left hand, it was already doing something extraordinarily difficult, playing a murmuring, independent line that walked its own path beneath the tune. The music was lyrical, but laced with a deep, aching tension. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty that demanded attention and respect. A whisper, sharp and hissed, cut through the opening phrases. My God, is that Rachmaninoff? It came from the critic from the Times, his notebook forgotten, his face pale. It was. Specifically, it was the opening of the third piano concerto by Sergei Rachmaninoff, a piece musicians referred to with a mix of awe and terror as Rach 3. It was one of the most technically difficult pieces ever written for the piano, a marathon for the fingers and the soul. And this woman, in her navy blue dress, was not just playing it. She was carving it out of the air with a commanding, granite-like certainty. Her hands were a blur of controlled motion. The simple, elderly woman was gone. In her place was a musician of fierce concentration. Her fingers, which had seemed frail moments before, now possessed a startling strength and independence. They leaped wide intervals with unerring accuracy. They trilled rapidly, creating a shimmering effect. They powered through thickets of notes that sounded like three hands playing, not two. The crowd was utterly transformed. The air of condescending amusement had evaporated, replaced by a collective, breathless shock. People were not just listening. They were staring, their bodies leaning forward unconsciously, drawn to the spectacle. A famous violinist seated at a front table had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. The wealthy industrialist had stopped talking about stocks entirely. His cigar, burning unattended in an ashtray. Victor Kane felt the room disappear. He heard only the piano. He saw only the hands. His mind, trained over decades, followed her every move, and it was dismantling his assumptions one by one. Her technique was not just competent. It was profound. She was using a subtle, old-fashioned fingering for a particular run that he had only read about in masterclass notes from the last century. Her pedaling, the use of the piano's dampers, was exquisite, creating washes of sound that blended without becoming muddy. She was not playing the full orchestral score, of course. This was a masterful reduction, a version for solo piano that captured the concerto's immense spirit. And she was playing it from memory. A wave of heat rushed to his face, followed by a cold sweat. This was no joke. This was a catastrophe, his catastrophe. He had tried to make her a punchline, and instead, he had introduced a master. The smirk was long gone from his face. His expression was one of dawning, horrified recognition. He was not listening as a patronizing host anymore. He was listening as a peer, and what he heard was humbling. The music swelled. Martha attacked a series of crashing, dissonant chords, her entire body moving with the effort, not in a theatrical way, but with the necessary force of a sculptor striking marble. The piano, a magnificent instrument, responded with a roar that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. Then, just as suddenly, she pulled back, drawing from it a whisper so soft and tender it felt like a secret being shared. The dynamic control was breathtaking from thunder to a sigh. In a heartbeat. She was not playing it safe. She was taking risks. In a particularly treacherous passage, where the right hand has to skip wildly, while the left hand maintains a restless rhythm, she sped up slightly, driving toward the climax with a wild, desperate energy that was more compelling than any technically perfect, cautious performance. It was alive. It was dangerous. It was heart-breaking. Her friend from the corner was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. She knew, perhaps alone in the room besides Martha herself, what this moment truly cost. She knew about the old upright piano in Martha's sitting room, its keys yellowed with age. She knew about the hands that had taught countless children their scales, that had prepared simple accompaniments for school plays, that had folded in prayer at a graveside. To see those hands now, unleashed, speaking this profound and forgotten language, was overwhelming. The piece built to a furious, cascading climax. Martha's body was taut with the effort, every ounce of her being focused on the torrent of notes. It was a physical as well as a musical feat, and then, with a final, ringing series of octaves that soared up the keyboard, she reached the end of the excerpt. Her hand slammed down on the final triumphant chord and held it, letting the sound fill every corner of the vast room until it faded into nothingness. She lifted her hands slowly and placed them back in her lap. Her shoulders slumped, the immense energy draining from her. The connection was broken. The spell was over. For a long, long moment, there was absolute quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm. No one clapped. No one moved. They were all still trapped in the world she had built, struggling to return to the ballroom, to the champagne, to their own identities. The first sound was not applause. It was a single, sharp intake of breath from the violinist at the front table. Then, as if that breath broke a dam, the room erupted. It was not polite, patronizing clapping. It was a roaring, standing ovation. Chairs scraped back as people leaped to their feet. The sound was deafening whistles, shouts of brava, the kind of unrestrained applause reserved for once-in-a-lifetime performances. The waiters, who had been still as statues, now broke into wide grins and joined in. The socialite in green was clapping so hard her hands were red. Martha sat perfectly still on the bench, looking small again amidst the roaring crowd. She seemed dazed, blinking slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then finally she turned her head and looked out at the sea of standing, applauding people. There was no triumph in her face, no gloating, just a kind of weary, peaceful exhaustion, and perhaps a faint shadow of surprise, as if she herself could not quite believe what had just happened. Her eyes then moved to the man standing by the piano. Victor Kane was not applauding. He was simply staring at her. All the color had drained from his face. The great Victor Kane looked utterly shattered. The ovation roared around him, but he seemed locked in a silent bubble with her. He was a man who had built his life on knowing who was great and who was not, on being the final word. And in the space of a few minutes, a woman in a simple blue dress had rewritten every single one of those words. The truth was in the music, and it had left him exposed. He was still leaning against the piano, but now it seemed to be the only thing holding him up. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. The stunned silence was his alone now, in the middle of the cheering crowd. The applause was a living thing, a wave of sound that washed over the piano and the small woman sitting before it. It went on, fueled by shock and genuine awe. The standing ovation showed no sign of stopping. Men who had been bored just minutes before were now shouting, "Encore!" The socialite who had smirked was now looking at Martha with something like reverence, but Martha did not stand up to take a bow. She simply sat there on the bench, her hands still folded in her lap, her head slightly bowed. The great roar seemed to flow around her, not touching her. She looked like someone who had just run a long, hard race and needed a moment to catch her breath, to remember where she was. Slowly, the applause began to die down. People realized she was not going to play again, not going to acknowledge the cheers in the usual way. A new kind of tension filled the room. All eyes flicked from Martha to the man still standing rigidly by the piano. The silence that returned was even heavier than the one before she played. It was a waiting silence, thick with the unasked question. Asterisk, what happens now? Asterisk Victor Kane finally moved. It was a small movement, just pushing himself away from the piano's polished side where he had been leaning. But in that room, it felt as significant as a curtain rising. He took 2 slow steps toward the bench. His face was pale, his earlier confidence completely gone. He looked every one of his years and more. He stopped a few feet from her. He opened his mouth, closed it, and tried again. When the words finally came, they were not the rich, projected tones of the maestro from before. They were quiet, rough around the edges, meant only for her, though the entire room strained to hear. "Madam," he began. He cleared his throat. That was extraordinary. He paused, as if the word were completely inadequate. He shook his head slightly, a gesture of pure disbelief. "Where? How did you?" He couldn't even finish the sentence. His hand gestured weakly toward the piano, then toward her. The question hung in the air. Asterisk, who are you? Asterisk Martha looked up at him. Her gray-blue eyes were clear and calm, but deeply tired. There was no anger in them, no glint of victory. She seemed to be considering him, and the question with great care. The room held its breath. She took a slow, quiet breath of her own. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but in the perfect silence, every syllable carried to the back of the hall. It was the same plain, earnest voice she had used in the corner, but now it had a gravity that pinned everyone in place. "Thank you," she said simply. Then she looked past him, not at the crowd, but as if seeing a different room, a different time. "You asked for a simple tune, a folk song." A very faint, almost sad smile touched her lips. "Life is rarely that simple, is it?" She shifted on the bench, turning her body slightly to face the room a little more. Her hands, which had been still, now rested gently on the edge of the keyboard. She was not addressing just Victor anymore. She was speaking to everyone. Nearly 60 years ago, she began, her voice gaining a soft, remembering strength. "I was a student at the conservatory in Warsaw. A very different world." Her gaze grew distant. "I lived for the piano. From the moment I woke up to the moment, my fingers grew too stiff to move at night. My teachers, they were kind. They said I had a gift. They said I had a brilliant future ahead of me." She paused. The memory was a physical presence in the room. You could almost see the ghost of the young girl she had been, sitting at an old practice piano in a sunlit room. "Then," she continued, and the two words were like a door closing, "life happened." She said it without self-pity. It was just a fact. The war came. Then the occupation. Nothing was the same. The future, that future they talked about, it melted away. It became about survival, about keeping your family safe, about finding bread and coal for the stove. The piano became a luxury, then a memory. She looked down at her own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. Later, there was displacement. A new country, a new language, a husband to build a life with, children to raise. There was joy in that. So much joy. But it was a busy joy. It was a joy that filled your hands with other work. She smiled a little then, a real smile, thinking of her children. "I taught music. In a small school. I taught children how to hold their hands, how to read those little dots on the lines. I played for assemblies. I played Happy Birthday 1,000 times. I played simple tunes." She looked directly at Victor then. "There is a beauty in simple tunes, you know. They have their own truth." Victor could only nod, unable to speak. "And then," Martha said, her voice dropping even softer, "there are the quieter times. A husband grows ill. You sit by a bed. He passes. The house becomes very, very quiet. The children have their own lives, far away. And in that quiet, the memories come back. Not as a sad thing, just as old friends." She gestured to the piano. "I have an old upright at home. It doesn't hold its tune very well, but it's enough. In the evenings, I would sit, not to practice, just to remember. The notes were still there. My fingers, they remembered the shapes. The music was sleeping inside them, waiting." Now she looked at Victor with a directness that made him want to look away. But he couldn't. "You mocked a simple woman tonight, Mr. Kane." The statement was not an accusation. It was just another fact, delivered quietly. A small gasp rippled through part of the crowd. He flinched as if she had struck him. "You saw the dress," she went on. "You saw the age. You saw someone who did not belong in your world. And so you thought it would be amusing to ask for a little performance, to have a bit of fun." She shook her head slowly. "You play for the world, sir. You play in these grand halls. You play for the reviews and the recordings and the applause. There is nothing wrong with that. It is a great thing." She paused, letting her words settle. But the piano, she said, and she laid her hand flat on the glossy black wood of the instrument beside her, a gentle, possessive touch. The piano is a honest thing. It doesn't see the gowns or the fame. It doesn't hear the titles or read the bank accounts. It only answers to two things, the heart and the memory. She took her hand away. I stopped playing for the world a very long time ago, but I never forgot how to play for the soul. My own soul. The souls of the children I taught. The memory of my husband, who loved to hear me play Chopin late at night. That music tonight. It wasn't for you. It wasn't for them. She nodded toward the audience. It was for all of that. For the life lived. For the girl I was and the woman I became. She finished, and there was nothing else to say. The truth of her words filled the room, so plain and so powerful that it left no room for argument, for cleverness, for anything but humility. Victor Kane stood before her, utterly still. The color had not returned to his face. His eyes were bright, shimmering with a wetness he did not try to hide. The great maestro, the untouchable virtuoso, looked completely dismantled. The armor of his ego had been peeled away, note by devastating note, word by quiet word. He did something then that no one in that room had ever seen him do. He took a final step forward, bent at the waist, and gave a deep, slow, formal bow. It was not a bow of patronizing grace. It was the bow of a student to a master, of someone who has been shown a truth he had overlooked. He held the bow for a long moment. When he straightened, his voice was thick with emotion. "Madam," he said, the word full of a new and profound respect. "Thank you. You have. You have reminded me of what the music is for. For that, I am in your debt." He then turned to the stunned, silent crowd. His voice, when he spoke to them, was different. The performance was over. This was just a man speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have been in the presence of something rare. Not just a performance. A lesson." And with that, he offered his hand to Martha to help her rise from the bench. She looked at it for a second, then placed her hand in his. He did not pull her up. He simply supported her as she stood. Together, they faced the room. And this time, when the applause began again, it was not a roaring ovation, but something deeper and more sincere. A sound of respect, of apology, of shared understanding. It was the sound of an audience that had come for a concert and had witnessed, instead, a piece of a human life laid bare in the most beautiful way possible. The applause that followed Victor Kane's bow was different. It wasn't the explosive roar from before. It was slower, warmer, full of a dawning respect. People weren't just clapping for the music anymore. They were clapping for the story. They were clapping for her. Martha, with Victor's hand lightly under her elbow, gave a small, uncertain nod to the room. The floodlights of attention felt harsh again, now that the spell of the music was broken. She just wanted to sit down, to find her friend, to have a glass of water. The energy that had poured out of her at the piano was gone, leaving a deep hollow of fatigue. Victor seemed to sense this. He leaned in close, his voice for her alone. "Please, let me get you to your table. Can I get you anything?" His tone was one of genuine concern, a complete reversal from his earlier manner. She nodded silently. As he began to guide her through the crowd, a strange thing happened. The sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits parted for them. But now, people weren't stepping back to avoid the simple woman. They were making space with a new reverence. A few reached out gently as she passed. "Magnificent," murmured the elderly violinist, her eyes still wet. "Thank you," whispered another woman, touching Martha's sleeve lightly. Martha just kept her eyes forward, a small, tired smile on her lips. She felt like she was walking in a dream. They reached her corner table. Her friend was already on her feet, pulling out Martha's chair and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Oh, you wonderful, wonderful thing," her friend said. Her voice choked. Victor hovered awkwardly for a moment, like a much younger man unsure of his place. "Some water, please. And the brandy. The good one," he said to a waiter who had materialized instantly. He pulled out the other chair at the small table and sat down, not waiting for an invitation. He needed to sit. The world was still tilting underneath him. For a few minutes, there was quiet at their table. The party around them had resumed its hum, but the sound was different. The conversations were animated, heads close together, everyone talking about what they had just seen and heard. Glances kept drifting toward the corner. Martha sipped the water the waiter brought, her hand steady. Now Victor finally broke the silence. He swirled the brandy in his glass, not drinking it. He looked at Martha, his expression unguarded. "Warsaw," he said softly. "You studied with Leszczynski?" Martha looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Yes, for a short time before he fled." A slow nod from Victor. "I thought I recognized the influence in your phrasing. A particular weight in the left hand." "He was a giant. He was a hard man," Martha said with a faint smile. "But he heard something. He said I had too much heart for my own good, that it would get in the way of technique." She gave a little shrug. "I suppose he was right." "He was wrong," Victor said, the force in his voice surprising even himself. "What we just heard, that was the heart leading the technique. That is the only thing that matters in the end. The rest is just typing." He looked down, ashamed. "I had forgotten that. Or perhaps I never truly knew it in the way you do." Martha didn't argue. She just listened. "I am so terribly sorry," Victor said, the words coming out in a rush. "What I did was cruel. It was small. I wanted to feel big, and I thought I could use you to do it." He met her gaze, his own full of a painful honesty. "I have been that man for a very long time." Martha studied his face. She saw the famous pianist, but she also saw a boy who had probably been pushed very hard, who had learned to measure his worth in encores and standing ovations. She felt no urge to punish him further. He was doing that well enough on his own. "You gave me the piano," she said simply. "However you meant it, you gave me the chance to speak again with an old friend. For that, I can't be angry." Her forgiveness, so quietly given, seemed to humble him even more. He shook his head, unable to speak for a moment. The party was winding down. People began to drift toward the doors, but many made a point of passing by their table. They didn't interrupt, but they would catch Martha's eye and give a respectful nod, or place a hand briefly over their heart. It was clear her corner was now the most important place in the room. A well-dressed man with an assistant hovering behind him approached tentatively. He was a prominent concert promoter. "Maestro," he said to Victor, then turned to Martha with deep respect. "Madame," that was a historic moment. Absolutely historic. "My name is—" He said his name, but Martha didn't quite catch it. "I would be honored if you would consider—" Well, the world should hear this. We could arrange a recital, a tour, the story alone. People would be inspired. Martha listened politely. When he finished, she shook her head, a firm but gentle motion. "Thank you, but no. That's not for me. This," she gestured vaguely around the ballroom, "was an accident. A happy one, perhaps. But my music belongs in my sitting room, or in the memory of my students. Not on a stage." The promoter opened his mouth to protest, but Victor raised a hand. "Please," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Respect her wishes." The promoter, seeing the look on the great pianist's face, simply bowed and retreated. As Martha's friend went to fetch their coats, Victor and Martha were alone again for a moment. The ballroom was nearly empty, the staff beginning to clear glasses. "What will you do tomorrow?" Victor asked. It felt like an important question. Martha thought about it. "I will go home on the train. I will feed Mr. Tibbles, my cat. I will probably play a little on my old upright. Something simple. Maybe some Chopin." She smiled. "And then I will have a cup of tea." The normalcy of it, the profound peace in her description, struck Victor deeply. His own tomorrows were a blur of airports, practice rooms, hotel suites, and the pressure of the next performance. "Can I—" He started, hesitant. "Can I at least drive you home? My car is here. It's no trouble." Martha looked at him, seeing the genuine offer behind the gesture. She saw a man trying clumsily to build a small bridge. She nodded. "That would be kind. Thank you." The ride was quiet. Martha sat in the back of the luxurious car, looking out at the sleeping city. Victor sat beside her, not knowing what to say. There was no more performance left in either of them. When the car pulled up to her modest, terraced house, Victor got out and opened her door. He walked her to her gate. The night was cool and still. "Good night, Mr. Kane," Martha said, taking her key from her bag. "Victor, please," he said. She nodded. "Good night, Victor. And thank you for the music earlier. Your Beethoven. It was very fine. Especially the second movement. You remembered the feeling." It was the same quiet observation she had made in the ballroom that had started it all. But now, coming from her, it was the highest praise he had ever received. He felt a lump in his throat. "Good night," he managed to say. He stood at the gate until she was inside and a soft light came on in the front window. He looked at the small, neat house, so different from his own grand apartment. He thought about the old upright inside and the woman who played for her soul. As his car pulled away, he knew one thing for certain. The story would not end here. It would leak out. Someone's phone video, the whispers of the guests, it would become a legend. The night the maestro was schooled, he would be asked about it in every interview for years. He made a decision then. He would not hide from it. He would tell the truth. And he knew something else, too. He could not undo his behavior, but he could honor her. Not with grand gestures she didn't want, but with something quiet, something real. A week later, a check arrived at the small primary school where Martha had taught for decades. It was a sizable donation, anonymous, to fund a new music program specifically for older students who showed a late-blooming passion. The note simply said, "For the simple tunes and the souls who play them." A month after that, in an interview with a major magazine, Victor Kane was asked about his most memorable performance. He didn't talk about Carnegie Hall or the Royal Albert Hall. He told them about a gala, a woman in a blue dress, and a piece by Rachmaninoff that shook him to his core. "She wasn't the performer that night," he said, his voice serious. "I was the audience. And she taught me more in 7 minutes than I had learned in 40 years. We chase perfection, but we forget that music is about humanity. It's about a life, heard through the fingers." Back in her sitting room, Martha read the interview a friend had clipped for her. She shook her head with a soft chuckle, patted Mr. Tibbles on the head, and sat down at her old, out-of-tune upright. She played a gentle, flowing melody by Chopin. It was just for her. It was for the memories. It was, as she had said, for the soul. And in the quiet of her room, with no one to hear but the cat, it was more than enough. The story, of course, did not stay in the ballroom. It was too good, too human. In the age of smartphones, it was impossible. While no one had dared to film the entire, shocking performance, snippets had been captured. A 9-second clip of Martha's powerful hands flying over the keys, Her face, a mask of fierce concentration, found its way online. It was grainy, shaky, but the audio was clear enough. The thunderous, complex chords, the collective gasp of the crowd. Someone else had caught Victor Kane's deep, stricken bow by the next afternoon. It was a sensation. The headlines wrote themselves. Unknown pensioner stuns world-famous pianist. The gala guest who played Rachmaninoff's Ratch 3. Maestro humbled in London. The video clip was shared millions of times. People were captivated by the contrast. A modest woman and the monumental music, the famous man's face crumbling into awe. For Victor Kane, the world became a cacophony of questions. His publicist's phone rang off the hook. Every interview request now had a single burning focus. Tell us about the woman at the gala. At first, he was tempted to give a polished, safe answer, to call it a beautiful, surprising moment and move on. But he remembered the look in Martha's eyes, her quiet truth. He had spent a lifetime performing. He decided for once to just be honest. In a televised conversation with a respected arts presenter, he was asked directly. He didn't smile his charming smile. He looked tired and thoughtful. It was not my finest hour, he began, his voice low. I saw someone who seemed out of place, and in a moment of profound arrogance, I thought I could make the room smile at her expense. I was the one who was out of place. She played. She played not just the notes, but the entire life behind them. A life of loss, of love, of quiet perseverance. She didn't just perform Rachmaninoff. She was Rachmaninoff in that moment, all that sorrow and yearning and impossible beauty. She didn't just leave me stunned. She left me changed. His words, so uncharacteristically vulnerable, gave the story even more weight. Now it wasn't just a viral clip. It was a parable about hubris and hidden depth. Meanwhile, in her small terraced house, Martha's world changed in a different way. The doorbell rang. A steady stream of reporters, talent scouts, and documentary filmmakers crowded her neat front garden. They called through the letterbox, left stacks of business cards on her step. At first, her friend helped her turn them all away, drawing the curtains and refusing to answer the door. But one persistent young woman from a local newspaper camped out on the pavement for 3 hours. She wasn't pushy. She just sat there, looking earnest. Eventually, Martha, peeking through the curtains, took pity. She opened the door just a crack. "Please," the young reporter said, "I don't want to bother you. Everyone is talking about the music, and it's amazing. But I'd rather write about the teacher. Would you tell me about the children?" That was the question that disarmed her. Martha let her in for a cup of tea. The resulting article was not about a viral sensation. It was a portrait of a retired schoolteacher who had devoted her life to introducing hundreds of ordinary children to the joy of music. It mentioned the old upright piano, the cat, the simple rhythm of her days. It quoted her as saying, "The most important piece I ever played was a shaky twinkle. Twinkle performed by a 7-year-old with 2 missing front teeth. That was real magic." This article, too, was widely read. It completed the picture. Martha was not a hidden genius waiting for a spotlight. She was a whole person who had chosen a different kind of richness. The public's fascination deepened from curiosity into a profound respect. Offers continued to pour in. A publisher wanted a memoir. A television network wanted a biopic. A famous talk show host, known for his emotional interviews, begged for just 10 minutes. Martha refused them all, with a gentle firmness that eventually made the world leave her alone. She had said what she needed to say, at the piano and afterward. There was nothing more to add, but the ripples of her playing spread in ways she never saw. In music schools, teachers told the story to proud students. Remember, technique serves the heart, not the other way around. Amateur pianists, adults who played in their living rooms after work, felt a new pride. Online forums buzzed with discussions not about Martha's fingering, but about her courage, her quiet defiance. She became a symbol for anyone who had ever kept a passion alive through the mundane struggles of life. Victor King, true to his private thought, did honor her. The anonymous donation to her old school was just the start. He quietly used a portion of his fee from several high-profile concerts to establish a small, non-profit foundation. He didn't put his name on it prominently. He called it the Crenshaw Fund, named in honor of Martha's late husband, a detail he had remembered from their brief conversation. Its mission was to provide grants and instruments to musicians over the age of 50 who had never had a formal chance, or who, like Martha, had set their music aside for life's demands. He never announced it publicly. He didn't need the credit. It was his penance and his promise. Occasionally, the Foundation's committee would receive a brief note from him, suggesting they look at an application from a retired postman who played beautiful blues guitar, or a grandmother who wrote symphonies on her home computer. He had learned to listen for the music that wasn't playing in concert halls. Months passed. The seasons changed. The news cycle moved on to other wonders and scandals. In her sitting room, life returned to a peaceful rhythm that Martha cherished. The old upright piano was tuned properly for the first time in a decade, a gift from a local piano tuner who had read the article and insisted, refusing payment. One crisp autumn evening, with a cup of tea steaming on a side table and her cat purring in a patch of fading sun, Martha sat at the piano. She wasn't thinking of galas or famous pianists. She was thinking of her husband, of the way he would read his newspaper in this very chair, a contented smile on his face as she played. Her hands settled on the keys. She didn't play Rachmaninoff. That was a language for a specific, powerful emotion, a storm they had now passed. Instead, she began a gentle, flowing nocturne by Chopin. It was melancholic, but sweet, like remembering a happy dream. The melody wove through the quiet house, a private conversation between her heart, her memory, and the instrument. She played without any thought of an audience. She played for the soul, just as she had said. The notes were not perfect. A slight stiffness in her left pinky finger caused a tiny stumble, which she seamlessly folded into the next phrase, making it sound intentional. That was the freedom of playing for no one but yourself and the ghosts you loved. There was no judgment, only expression. As the last note faded, she sat in the comfortable silence, one hand resting on the smooth wood. She felt a deep and settled peace. The grand piano at the Langham had been a magnificent beast, but this old friend, with its scratches and its slightly soft middle C, was home. Outside, the world continued to spin. Somewhere, Victor Kane was taking a bow under blinding lights to a roaring crowd. Somewhere, a child was struggling through their first piano lesson. Somewhere, a person who had seen the clip was tentatively returning to an old hobby they had abandoned years before, their heart lifted by the story of a woman in a blue dress. But here, in the gathering dusk, there was just the echo of a beautiful tune, the warmth of a purring cat, and the unshakable knowledge that a life lived with quiet love for something beautiful was never a small life. It was a complete symphony, heard by the only audience that truly mattered, a grateful heart. She smiled, gave the piano lid an affectionate pat, and went to put the kettle on for another cup of tea. The music was over, but the melody of her life, rich and full, and exactly as she had chosen it, played on.